Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of QA Bytes. In the last episode, we discussed the role of test environment management in implementing effective automation and testing. Today I'm talking about common data-related issues and some techniques for addressing them. Unstable data is an extremely common cause of automated test execution issues. The biggest challenge is typically keeping application data in sync with the tests. This takes on two forms. One where the tests are inputting data that is no longer appropriate given the current state of the data in the system under test. The other is where the test is expecting a certain data response and the system responds with something different. Why is the data out of sync? Because either it's been changed by some other activity, maybe it's data that can only be used once, or possibly the state of data was changed simply because of the passage of time. Independent of the reason, it all results in the inability to reliably execute automated tests on demand. And that flies directly in the face of what DevOps needs from test automation. So all of this points to a need for test data management. This is something we need to think about before we start building frameworks and tests, and certainly something that must be done before we need to execute them. If we're going to devise a strategy to manage our test data, first we need the data requirements associated with our tests. It's very easy to just begin creating tests and almost subconsciously include the data. However, we must investigate what I call the dimensions of that data. These are essentially the attributes of the data that describe how it lives and behaves in your system under test. First is the type of data. In most cases, this speaks to if it's structured, for example, data in a relational database, or unstructured, has no fixed format, length, or organizational pattern. Of course, the value of the data, either a specific value or a class of values, is important. Time is also an extremely important dimension. A lot of times when you have tests that pass for a period of time and suddenly start failing, time turns out to be the culprit. Maybe the data expired. For example, an insurance policy reached its expiration date. Reuse is another important dimension. This is the ability for test data to be reused or not. For example, if I'm testing an e-commerce system, the account I'm using to purchase items can likely be reused. However, if I'm testing shipping an order, I can only ship the specific order once. The final dimension is volume, or how much data is required. This almost always comes into play for load testing. For example, you need some number of user accounts to spread across your concurrent users. But there's also some subtleties here. Sometimes you have a specific data value that represents a volume, and you need that volume to be a certain value. Think about some level of inventory or some level of available credit for an account. Finally, we need to understand where the data lives. If we're going to possibly develop a strategy to manage it, we need to understand where it's coming from so we can evaluate our options for controlling it. There's not a step-by-step recipe for developing a test data management strategy. It can vary quite a bit from organization to organization and certainly application to application. There are just too many variables: where the data lives, what the dimensions are, the state of the test environments. It's better to talk about potential techniques so we can expand our tool belt and have more options when we dig into our own situations. First, there are some things we can do at the application level. Let's talk about the data refresh, essentially replacing the current data in your environment with data from a known state, or very often production. This is a fairly common approach, but the way it's typically done doesn't work very well in DevOps. Typically the refresh is done on some cadence that is way too slow. And also this may not work well for integrated systems that can't easily be refreshed at the same time. Next is data partitioning. This is where we dedicate certain data objects for use only by the automated test suites, maybe certain accounts, certain warehouses, etc. This helps with the issues related to shared test environments, assuming that other activity does, in fact, not use the data. We can also dedicate entire environments to test automation. Of course, this depends on several factors like complexity and cost. Those can be effective, but may not be flexible and nimble enough for DevOps. So there's some things we can do at the test suite level that lend themselves better to a DevOps environment. First, we can have our tests create the data they need prior to execution. This may often be combined with data partitioning to further lessen the chance of data-related issues. For example, a test might create some inventory, but the SKU and the inventory location used are designated for automation only. Similarly, we can have tests clean up after themselves, and this is typically done in conjunction with the pre-test data creation. Next, we can create entire test environments on demand. This is similar to having dedicated automation environments, but with the added twist that we're creating the environment in the state we need it, when we need it, and then we can blow it away if necessary. Finally, we have some techniques we can use to handle data that changes over time, or follow some rules that make it impossible to use the same data for each execution. In this case, we can build functionality into our frameworks that generates the data for us at runtime with the exact value we need at that time. And of course, we also have full-blown test management solutions that were purpose-built for managing data in test environments. The important takeaway here is to understand that A, test data management is important to automation and testing, and B, we have a decent tool belt of techniques that we can use to address it. However, it's extremely important to realize that you really have to understand your application, its data, and the environments you're working in to begin to discern what is appropriate for you. Thank you for watching this episode of QA Bytes. Tune into the next episode where we'll discuss the importance of production testing in a DevOps environment.